Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the final cheat sheet of this preseason. It's going to be the game week 1 cheat sheet. We've got a lot of information at this point. A lot of preseason games have finished. There's only one game left, which is going to be Spurs versus PSG. That game will happen tomorrow. And I think the only impacts coming out of that game will be on Solanke's fitness. But I have to imagine that he's nowhere near fit and ready to play consistent, serious minutes in game week 1. If you have to think about it from a Spurs perspective, why risk your key starting striker to play very serious minutes versus Burnley, which from an FPL point of view, you want as many minutes as possible versus Burnley at home. So I just don't see Solanke being a great pick from this perspective. Otherwise, you have Isak apparently claim that he will never play for Newcastle again. I think direction of travel means he goes towards Liverpool. What that sort of means as well is that has knock-on impacts on some of the other players. But it also might be the case that Newcastle refuse to sell him. We have seen cases where this has happened and clubs refuse to sell. So I think this sort of thing will go on. And inevitably, there will be some new transfers that we can't foresee by the time Game Week 1 starts. The transfer window will be live up until, let's say, Game Weeks 4 or 5, and therefore the information that you get from potentially an early wild card could be just simply benefiting from the information you get post Game Week 1. But I can't account for that, right? This is the Game Week 1 cheat sheet. Otherwise, this Game Week 1 cheat sheet has been powered by Fantasy Football Hub. The projections that I've used to support a lot of the analysis here, the underlying stats, which you get from the Opta Stats tool, with all the advanced data that you need, including some of the DEFCON points, are now all added within the Pro Suite. You have other things like, for example, the AI rating tool, so you can still get your draft rated for Game Week 1. Do let me know what your current draft rating is right now, and feel free to let me know what are the differential players that you think maybe the AI is underrated right now. Otherwise, you also have the sort of my team pick and rating tool, what I've already used within the transfer plans video. And there's a lot of things like, for example, pro team suggestions, etc. if you want to use the Pro Suite from Fantasy Football Hub. So as I said, have a look at the link in the description below. Sign up because they still have the offer of winning your mini league or getting your money back with T's and C's, of course. But without further ado, let's go to the cheat sheet. So starting with the midfield position, I think the 5 million position, I don't love it in FPL, right? I still think that this is a bit of a season of 3-5-2. If you go 3-4-3, I understand why. There's still a lot of appealing attackers, and a lot of attackers have been in form from the forward position. But that's probably only the draft structure where I like the 5s, right? If you're going with 3-4-3 and you've got 3 consistent attackers, and you kind of have a 5 million midfielder who actually seems like he's pretty decent, I'd probably go Granit Xhaka for now. I would have actually put Dewsbury Hall on this list, but I really think that Everton have almost too much depth at this point. And I'm not quite sure if his minutes are good enough to really justify him being a huge differential in your draft. So I have to say I'm pretty cold on Dewsbury Hall. Papentetis Sarr, I feel like Tottenham still seemingly are going to get someone in the 10 in the market. And his DEFCON numbers are solid, but I don't think his minutes are necessarily guaranteed if you, let's say, take away someone and kind of inject a new attacking player in that sort of 10 position. So I'm not in love with him, but I can understand why people are still intrigued by him because he's had a pretty good preseason. Either way, I still think you almost have to rely on these historic numbers. Yes, of course, you'd expect some of the attacking numbers to improve if he gets to play almost in a 10-like role. But is there lasting value in that? I'm not quite sure. So not really sold on him as a pick. Xhaka is the opposite, right? He's the opposite end of the coin in the sense that I feel like he's more of your consistent pick over the course of the season as opposed to sort of a positional short-term play in Papentetis Sarr. He might be on penalties. He's seemingly on all the other set pieces, but does that actually mean much? I'm not sure. I still think that the floor is quite low, unfortunately, for a Sunderland attacker, and that's unfortunately where I'm at. I feel the same very much about Adingra as well, even though Adingra clearly is a different type of player in the sense that he's just a pure open play attacker that should play a lot of minutes and probably guarantees the most minutes within that team's going forwards. In the 5.5 tier, though, this is where I think you start to actually get some serious value. These are players that I think would consistently play and can play within a 3-5-2 structure. Equally, I've seen a lot of no-salary drafts that have a 5.5 type player as their 8th attacker, and I kind of understand the reason for that, right? You still are almost trying to create the most value possible within a 3-4-3 potentially, and you still want someone who's pretty good off the bench. Anderson and Reinders are, once again, almost two sides of the coin. I think Anderson is someone who you are pretty much looking at. I want this player to be a 90-minute player to get UC bits, or C-Brits rather, and to hit that threshold of 12, the more minutes that he plays every single match guarantees you a better sort of percentage chance of actually getting those +2 points. And he is bolstered by these attacking fixtures at the start, where of course some of the set piece value will come into play, raising his floor a little bit higher than it usually would. So I think Anderson, from that perspective at the start of the season, is a bit of a foolproof pick. If you don't want to think about this position, if you don't really care about the 7th player in your draft, and you understand that you're using the value for the rest of your team, go for Anderson. He's a really safe pick. There's no issues. There's no sort of strings attached. With Reinders, I think there's a lot of contrasting opinions. Yes, of course, he had an absolutely brilliant season last year with AC Milan. 10 goals in open play within the league last season, 16 goals overall. That is very impressive, right? And you know, when you look at the game versus Palermo, a Serie B side, probably a, I don't know, 400 to 500 ranked team in the world, he looked brilliant. Can he still reproduce that in the Premier League? I think easily. The question once again is going to be on minutes, and not just on minutes necessarily, but also just about how you'd expect him to do, for example, if he was, let's say, to play a little bit deeper or to play a little bit more offensive. And I think the concern, I suppose, is that the injuries within City right now are deeper, whereas if he was to play more attacking, there's still a lot more depth to compete with. So, for example, someone like Ryan Cherky, which was his direct substitute in the last preseason game, you know, played 45 minutes beforehand. The rest of the picks here, I think, are quite situational. I think Arias is actually very good. But once again, I feel like to probably go for him, you kind of want a little bit more from him, in the sense that you must be thinking he's a purely talismanic player. And I think he is that quality, right? When you look at how important he was to that Fluminense team, and I compare to some of the unfortunately worse attackers within this Wolves team, I think he's a step above most of the other players out wide, right? So I think Arias should be a 90-minute player. And the underlying stats are very, very positive for someone at this price point who could also be on penalties. I don't think he's on penalties, but he's on a lot of other set pieces. And I think that already instantly gives him value. If he's a 90-minute player, he potentially is a sort of green-sided pick. But I still think that some of the concerns, which are, once again, you're looking at maybe the second more important attacker for this Wolves team. So how much value are you going to get from that? And of course, is it similar to, let's say, an Adingra situation where is the open play value not necessarily going to be transferred upon a much weaker Premier League team in the bottom half, who will probably struggle to get the numbers that he has had in a slightly better team, in a slightly better team context. So yeah, I'm kind of interested in Arias, and I think he can be even better than where I've sort of priced him in, but I still hold some reservations just generally about the quality of Wolves. And as I said, it's almost like if you were to enjoy the most out of the Wolves team, I still think Strand Larsen is like that sort of best pick. Then picking the second best attacker from a pretty weak attacking team feels a little bit worse. In a way, it's not too dissimilar to maybe picking Fulkrug if you just needed to gap fill within your draft and you don't like an Anderson or a Reinders and the ownership that they carry right now. Malin, I feel like he's just dropped in terms of the priority. Yes, of course, he might get a start if Rodgers is not available in Game Week 1, just for the knock-on impacts of that and where Gassan will play. But I think signing Gassan has sort of hurt Malin quite a fair bit. I just don't think he's really worth that sort of risk to reward ratio. Yes, of course, the underlying numbers are really good, but I'm kind of just generally concerned about what he'll just produce in terms of minutes early on as it stands. Caicedo, I think, was just a pure floor pick. And you're still better off with other picks like Elliot Anderson, who's still more attacking than him at the end of the day. And also, it's a question of maybe if you're close to, let's say, a double up on Chelsea, is he really the third pick you want to go for, potentially? Or even leaving room, for example, for a potential 4.5 defender from this Chelsea team is more exciting to me than just having Caicedo at the start. In the next position, we have the sixes. I think the sixes are the positions that have grown in terms of, do I see more value in that position than I did a week ago? 100%. So you can see Paqueta has risen. Tielemans is exactly where he was previously, and Jorginho has risen as well. Rutter is now in my draft. This is Jorginho Rutter from Brighton. I think a lot of people look at his minutes last season and have a lot of questions about where I'm ranking him, and I kind of understand that. But equally, I think this is a player who very much is the second best player in the team following JP last season playing in the 10. You've now gone JP out. You have O'Reilly almost in because he's coming back from an injury. But it also seems like O'Reilly is due for a transfer, right? The news is linking him elsewhere. I just think that Jorginho is someone who is very much mimics João Pedro last season, and they don't have that sort of third string player who's at the sort of level of quality of a Welbeck or a João Pedro to actually take away so many minutes from Jorginho. He actually averaged around, I think, 60 minutes last season. This is a player who, before his injury, I think started 7 games in a row and actually played very consistent between 72 to 90 minutes a game. A lot of the matches, if you look at João Pedro last season, would be him starting at the 10, then actually filling, let's say, the last 15 to 20 minutes of the game playing striker in place of Welbeck. What I'm almost expecting will happen over the course of the first few games for Brighton is that could happen, right? Welbeck is 1 year on in age. He's quite old. If you think that some of the new attacking depth might, for example, give some competition towards, let's say, the 10 position, I tend to think the minutes will sort of move in the direction that I've foreseen, which is going to be a little bit more of the 90-sided games for Jorginho. But either way, I actually still see him as either the first or second best striker of the team, and definitely the best 10. I'm not really concerned about the amount of depth coming back into the club, because if you saw last season, they pretty much had the same issue. But we're then happy to loan more and more players progressively as the season went on. So Enciso, for example, was loaned out, and other players, of course, like Buonanotte and Sarmiento were already loaned out at the start of the season. So I'm not worried about Jorginho's minutes. I actually think he's got a lot of upside. When I look at the markets and the season-long sort of spread projections for his goals and assists, he's neck and neck with Mitoma, which once again sort of brings into question, do you need to spend that sort of money? And are you willing to sort of take that risk in a player who's a little bit less, I think, proven compared to, let's say, Mitoma? And I think, look, the consideration's up to you in terms of how you want to spend that 0.5. With Minte, I think it's a positional piece where if you're playing in the right wing position, you're probably more, assistive, right? But then maybe the minutes could be better, but Gruda is still there, right? Gruda is still someone who can play a mixture of 10 and right wing. And I think he's more likely going to occupy minutes wide. And so I think, yeah, that's kind of something that hurts Minte a little bit, but I expect him to kick on as well. I think both of these players are actually underrated in the sense that people probably are too pessimistic of these Brighton players. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but we'll talk about that in a moment. As far as Paqueta, for example, I just think that this season, you're most likely going to deal with a player here who should be starting most matches. I'm not saying he's a 90-minute player. I don't think he is. I think he's more so on that sort of 80-minute threshold where there are games where maybe you need a little bit of a different playstyle preference or whatever is needed to actually kind of, win the game. Something Fellaini-esque, like in terms of Souček. And I think that can sort of sub Paqueta off. He's clearly the only player that fits the sort of mold that they have for this team. I know they're in the market for Mateus Fernandes, but it doesn't seem like Southampton are willing to let him go. So that kind of makes me still confident at this moment in time that Paqueta is a very, very good pick, especially since we know penalties are there, DEFCON contributions are there, even though the open play numbers are not that inspiring. But I think you can compare that very similarly towards the Tielemans, right? And a lot of people would still be comfortable with Tielemans because part of it too is little things like expected clean sheets, giving you sort of slow tickers in terms of points per match. And then obviously that sort of floor with the DEFCON. Damsgaard I still think is actually a really solid pick. Is he someone that I really want to start with the season? Because I do think that Brentford actually looked really poor. They are also starting the season without Shade. Yeah, that's kind of what concerns me. This is probably the most creative player of the team. If the attacking players ahead of him that should be finishing, the chances that he creates are worse, I'm not so sure if I'm totally in love with Damsgaard, but I think he's actually really solid. Once again, he's kind of similar to a lot of these other picks where they're a good blend of CBIT earning players and DEFCON earning players, and he is almost the best open play creator compared to anyone else in this list. So I think that makes him pretty impressive. In the 6.5 tier, I think Njai is still solid. I'm really not too worried about his minutes. I think he's going to be a permanent starter for this Everton team, but there's clearly now scope for him to be subbed off much earlier. And I think less of the 90-minute games and the potential for the 90 games, more importantly, are there. Like even last season, we saw Njai was actually still struggling with sort of bagging those 90 minutes after the meniscus tear / injury. So I kind of feel like that's going to sort of resume itself, even though he's got, once again, all the intangibles that you would want to have, right? Penalties, a bit of DEFCON. But in a similar way, I think, a less or a more important version of Paqueta, if that makes sense. Mitoma, I feel like this is a player who actually scored 10 goals last season and should be starting the season fit, has played back-to-back 90s in his preseason games and looks ready to start the season off hot. I would expect for a good season from him, and for him to even maintain his baselines, I think he just becomes a very, very good pick. Whereas obviously when I look in the Jorginho and Minte context, I'm almost expecting them to improve a little bit more to be able to sort of come close to, let's say, the production of Mitoma. As far as Sar, yeah, I'll be honest. I've always been pro Sar. I do think that, does it make sense to maybe start without Sar in game week 1? Yes. Like if you're kind of angling something like a wildcard 4, a bit of a short-term strategy, does it really make sense to be invested into a player that is Chelsea away and Aston Villa away? Probably not. Even Nottingham Forest at home is a pretty mediocre game, just when you think about qualities of defenses over those 3 games. But is he that menacing? Is he one of the players with the sort of most freakish amount of non-penalty expected goal involvements per 90 and actually is a 90-minute player? Yes, to all those things. I think Sar is just, very solid. And to be honest, am I reacting to one game versus Liverpool? Sure, I am. But, he is that good on paper for the price point, and I look forward to owning him at some point in the season. As far as Enzo, I still think his minutes aren't as good as we'd probably like. I think there's going to be scope for Enzo to be not rotated necessarily, but then, if you're looking at a player and you're taking away things like 70 or like 10, 20 minutes of a game, that once again sort of ruins the the DEFCON contribution piece, and of course he doesn't sort of match some of the other open play attackers here, or has things like penalties. Kudus, I'm still not super confident in the minutes, and so I have to say I don't love him. Of course, Burnley at home is super enticing, and I think that's part of the reason why a lot of people have him. But yeah, I'm not super sold on his minutes right now, and I just think there's going to be a bit of growing pains as well, and a lot of mixing up, and we know that Spurs are still in the market for other players. We've even seen other right wingers kind of touted to join the team. So yeah, not too intrigued that Kudus is a pick. In the 7 million tier, I put an asterisk around Rodgers. There are still some massive question marks around Rodgers and his availability, and press conference will of course illuminate us as to this. If he's fit, if he's ready for game week 1, he's just a brilliant pick, and that's as simple as it is. With Semenyo, I think I've now sort of come around the corner. I mean, he's been green for a while now, but generally, of course, if you kind of are okay with having a little bit more of a medium to long-term plan, the Bournemouth players are just fantastic still. They're still at a really good price point. Semenyo, as I explained, is one of the few players, if you kind of descend this list, right, the average sort of defensive contribution numbers gets worse and worse and worse up until you get to Bruno. And we'll talk about Bruno in a moment. But yeah, Semenyo is in a world of his own here in terms of open play attackers, and I think that gives him a bit of a kick. Not to mention that, who knows, he could even be on penalties, and I think I've discussed this previously, so I won't go too deep into this topic, but he did score a penalty versus Everton in the FA Cup last season. Evan Nilsson's record last season was 0-1. I don't know if that's enough to influence things whilst Kluivert is out, and Kluivert, of course, is a void in the same price point. I've actually dropped Neto. I just think that the Chelsea depth, I mean, they're still clearly in the market for potentially another winger, or happy to do so. I'm not sure his minutes are going to be that good. And that's it, really. I'm not sold on Neto whatsoever. Jade is still injured, so doesn't seem like he's going to make it for game week 1, and probably should be an avoid at this point in time. At the 7.5 tier, I've kind of changed my thoughts in terms of Gakpo. I think he's always been a good pick, but once again, I would just like to iterate that he's green for the people who are willing to take a little bit of a risky pick, right? More so in the sense that if you're gearing for something like a wildcard for a short-term play, you are willing to, let's say, have a well-rounded, robust draft around everyone else but Gakpo, and you're willing to sort of let him be your punt. This still could be a player who starts a lot of the early games for Liverpool and plays somewhere between, like, let's say 80 to 90 minutes per game, as we saw, for example, in the Community Shield. And the biggest thing, of course, is just going to be what happens when Isak joins this team. But I don't think that me saying when actually makes sense, right? Because there's still a possibility that Isak doesn't, and Gakpo actually continues to be a really good pick. So I kind of like him. If you're angling for a punt, he's a really good punt and a really interesting price point because he's cheaper than Wirtz. He's a huge cost saving. And you can, for example, fit something in like, let's say, a Salah plus a Palmer plus a Gakpo plus a Watkins type of draft. But I don't think you can quite do that if you're going to extend that money towards Wirtz, right? Suddenly your defense looks a bit worse. So he's at an interesting price point. And not to mention, he's a really good pivot if you want to punt into Gakpo for the first 3 weeks and suddenly you're looking across the pond and Eze's moved somewhere and he's maybe a consistent starter for a Spurs. Not too bad a side grade at some point in time. Gibbs White, I feel like I maybe overestimated how good he is. Still, once again, with the sort of open play numbers. So I've just given him a soft drop. I think that was just a bit over eager for me, despite the fixtures being that good. Gordon still has a bit of a niggle. With Newcastle, I still think the opening fixtures are tough. And they're going to sign someone, I would imagine, who would take pens away from Gordon. Right now, he looks really good. Season-long spreads have him at a really good goal margin, but I kind of think that will just progressively drop over time. So not really worth starting with him. In the 8.5 tier, I love Wirtz. And I think that argument of Wirtz versus Watkins is still very valid. I think even though I've seen Watkins in pretty much every draft that I've possibly seen, I've also seen some sort of Wirtz drafts where you have Bruno as well, right? So if you're thinking about these 3 players or even 4 players, if I extend this towards Marmoush as well, these 4 players at the sort of price point between 8.5 to 9 are quite popular. And going whatever variation of the 2 out of 4, I think is solid. Well, 2 out of 3. I think Marmoush is almost a tier below a Watkins, clearly, and a Bruno and a Wirtz. And I really think that if you go with 2 out of 3, you're probably happy with those picks. Marmoush, I just still feel like his minutes are a little bit uncertain. As I said, if he has the minutes and he's starting every single match, playing more than 75 minutes per game, I think he's broken, Marmoush, to be honest. But I just think they have too much depth, and I'm a little bit cold on Marmoush right now. Saka, on the other hand, I've actually given a rise. I think there's definite scope for Arsenal to just be a better attack this season, and we've already seen elements of that within the preseason in terms of just the very, very small sample size of data on Arsenal's attacking patterns, and that gives me a little bit of energy to to say I'm interested in Saka once again. I've seen a lot of interest towards the no Salah drafts, and I really think it is valid. But once again, it always comes down to what is your risk preference in FPL? Are you willing to take on the field? These kind of questions will always be answered just by your own preference, right? But Saka will help you achieve that if you are on a no Salah draft, for example, or maybe even on a Haaland draft, and suddenly, I'm not sure how, but you've been able to sort of afford that money, and you're let's say bypassing that sort of 2 out of 3 aspect of what I talked about with a Wirtz, a Bruno, and a Watkins. But yeah, I do feel like to respect the sort of quality of Saka, and I still think he'll probably take that first penalty when it comes by towards this Arsenal team. So yeah, I've given Saka a rise. In the forward position here, I've only added a new 4.5 to the 4.5 tier. As far as Krupi Jr., he seems like someone who could actually just play a lot of minutes this season, especially if there's like an injury, for example. Like, we have to remind ourselves that Enes Ünal still has that ACL injury, and he had that late. If Evan Nilsson's suddenly injured, I wouldn't be surprised that instead of Dango up top, maybe you get Krupi Jr. starting games. He's already gotten some preseason minutes. I think he'll be a part of the team. I think he'll be on the periphery. But there's always that question of, let's say, if you is a striker, what's the value of that versus some guy coming off the bench versus for a really, really strong sort of attacking team that has always been tilted towards attack. And, you know, how long will it take for you to get to hit the ground running and be operational? I'm not too sold on either. I think maybe you still makes sense in terms of if I was to forecast minutes and how easy it is for, you know, either player to get into the team. Keep in mind, Krupi Jr. is an extremely young player as well. Clearly signed to be a long-term talent for Bournemouth. He was only playing League 2 last season, so League 2 being the French second division. So that does make things different, but he did score a lot of goals. As far as the next tier, 5.5, I really think the only use case for Pirro is a bench boost 1, and if you even are doing it, it almost suggests you're also going to do an early wildcard, which I don't like. I've given Fulkrug the green tier at 6 million. I just feel like Wilson doesn't seem like he's ready whatsoever. So to start the season, I think Fulkrug's minutes look pretty good. I've actually, you know, not sort of shared the same feelings with Igor Thiago because it seems like Brentford's in the market for another striker. Once again, I think if we're talking about fitness and being available for the start of the season, kicking the ground, running, Fulkrug's at that point, right? He's had really good preseason minutes. He's fit finally, and that makes a huge difference. I had this sort of funny discussion with some of the people, for example, who are members of the channel, that sort of private chat that I have, and you know, the question was raised as to, you know, Fulkrug only scored 1 goal every 262 minutes last season. How can we rate someone like that? And personally, I think when you look at someone like that, I think there's reasons that are very valid to sort of explain why he had such a poor season. This is a player who kind of just never had a good preseason ramp up last season under Emery, and was pretty much a peripheral player, and so was coming off the bench, and then was only pretty much coming off after injuries and trying to regain fitness. And so a lot of the minutes are almost garbage minutes. It kind of reminds me actually of DCL in some previous seasons, where you're almost envisioning to have, let's say, someone who has a good fixture run, could be on penalties, for example. Not in Fulkrug's case, in my opinion, even though his penalty record is absolutely stellar. I think it's 27 over 29, which is just ludicrous. But yeah, I think he's actually got a good game week 1 to start, and that makes him very appealing for a lot of people, and I understand the appeal. That's all I'm saying. 6.5, Strand Larson, I think is great. Looking at the season-long goal tallies, he's actually probably the most mispriced forward. I have spoken about that previously. Do people look at Strand Larson and think he's an absolutely horrid pick? Yes, it seems like it, but I still think there's a lot of value in here. The minutes look secure. I would still picture that he's going to be the penalty taker for the team. So on that basis, I really like Strand Larson still. Then I have Welbeck, who I still think is going to start the season at striker. I wouldn't be so worried about him sort of being the B team in the preseason, but does that sort of cool off my interest in Welbeck? Yeah. And that's also given me a little bit more interest in towards Jorginho, right? If I'm expecting for Jorginho to be that 90-minute player who almost takes some of the extra striker minutes that Welbeck might leave if he gets subbed off early, then that's, you know, where you can see my sort of thoughts in terms of Welbeck's minutes are. I don't think he's necessarily a 90-minute player to start the season permanently. Evan Nilsson, I really do like. He's at an interesting price point where a lot of people are shopping for 7.5s, maybe not so intrigued with the 6 to 6.5s, but this is a proven player for a top half offense, and so that's what you're getting with Evan Nilsson, who might even start the season with penalties. I'm not really sure which way I'd swing it between Semenyo and Evan Nilsson. I feel like if Kluivert wasn't on the pitch, it could be a genuine 50-50, and I wouldn't be surprised if either took. So that's kind of my thoughts on Evan Nilsson. But his numbers have always been really strong. Look at the NPXG per 90. I'd have faith in that. In the 7.5 tier, I feel like João Pedro Mateta have probably just been underrating. Mateta, for the fixture point of view, it's poor, but if you have a bit of medium to long view, wonderful pick, and Kedia being out just as huge, that's a 90-minute merchant right there. João Pedro, yeah, he's almost scoring with every other shot. Do I expect that to continue happening? No, Do I expect him to perform better than last season in terms of the NPXG per 90 with a much better team that seems like he's able to play off a lot better? Yes. And that might just be enough with the really, really good run of fixtures at the start to make him a wonderful pick. And no surprise that he's actually the most popular pick in the game in the forward position. Solanke, I've given a bit of a boost. I still think I wouldn't risk it, right? Burnley at home is so enticing. The price point of Solanke is so enticing. But yeah, I'm not really sold. Maybe the PSG start, if it actually does happen, would completely change my mind. But that's not what I'm envisioning, right? Which is why I have Solanke where he is. As far as Ekitike, I still think there's some concerns because there's some Isak knock-on impacts. But actually, if let's say Isak doesn't join Liverpool, I think Ekitike is a green pick. That's sort of my take, right? I'm almost balancing here. And I feel like compared to, let's say, the Gakpo pick, it's a little bit of a sacrifice because you are spending 8.5 million on a player. And that's a very sort of unique price point to be spending within. Whereas, let's say with the Gakpo sort of pick, you almost have some nice pivots at the 7.5 position, especially if Eze is alive for you. And it's less money spent on a punt, right? So that's kind of why I'm not super sold on Ekitike. But at the same time, that probably means less people are on him, and that makes him a better punt sometimes. At the 9 million tier, I think Watkins is just stellar. Gyökeres, I still think probably some earlier starts at the beginning, and then progressively maybe better minutes as we go on. I've always been pro Gyökeres. I think he'll do well in the league. I've never questioned that for a second. And I'm just excited. I'm excited to see what this Arsenal team can kind of transform into, especially as we've asked so many questions about where this attack is going to go directionally. Isak still in a void, or now, downgraded to being in a void. And Haaland, still an amazing pick, I think. I really think that no Salah is viable, but it's a risk preference thing. And just looking at some of the models, looking at the projections, it's not too dissimilar. But once again, the question of, are you willing to take 180% of ownership is there? And interesting, I'm actually seeing a lot of people prioritize things like maybe having an even more well-rounded team than let's say necessarily finding that the best way to go no Salah is actually going for Haaland. I feel like Nomium and Haaland are actually quite similar in terms of the appeal to other players, but once again, to each their own. As far as defense, I really don't think there are many changes. This might be shocking to you, but the defense is actually a position where I feel like it's actually really safe, really stable. Nothing has really changed my mind other than some of the transfer news, right? So Guehi seems like he's very close towards a move now, whether it be Chelsea, whether it be Liverpool. There's a bit of a bidding war. I'm sure that Crystal Palace is almost instructing here. And I just think if you're looking for a player who you want it to be a nailed-on Palace option, take him out. If he goes towards Liverpool, I don't see him being nailed. If he goes towards Chelsea, that's a different story. But you can't almost make that decision game week 1 based on the information that we have. So unfortunately, I'm a little bit cool on the value or the utility of Guehi in a draft. I think, once again, Estev fills a lot of our ambitions, especially if you're rotating game week 2. Is he necessarily the best 4? No. I think there's actually really a real closeness between all these picks. Reynaldo, probably the most interesting attacking pick if you want that sort of classic 4 million from that perspective. What I really like is that you actually have some mid-table defenses or better at the 4.5 position, and that's what I mean by Anderson, Richards. And we're expecting, for example, Spurs to improve a little bit, which means Van de Ven is still quite solid. And I do like the fixtures at the start to rotate around. Diouf, as I've mentioned, is just, for me, my favorite West Ham attacker or attacking wingback. And yeah, there's no questions on that. I'm sold just from what I've watched. Dorgu I still find interesting, but I think when you look at the 4.5s who are more yellow, I feel like they're more so players that you'd feel a little bit less comfortable playing game to game, but more so want them for just rotation, right? Like, let's say Liverpool have, or let's say if your defender, for example, has a bad game in game week 2, what the 4.5 in the sort of yellow tier should really achieve is, covering that sort of position. So what do I mean by that? Senesi is a really good example of that, right? If you want to cover a bad game week 2, if you wanted to cover a bad game week 3, that's where Dorgu comes in. So I feel like that's kind of what the yellow pick is doing. De Kuyper could be on penalties. He could also be on absolutely nothing when it comes to penalties, but he actually has a stupendous penalty record. I think he's 9 for 10 in Club Brugge, and so that's really impressive, and who knows, he might be on penalties. Might be the first time in a long time that we've had a penalty-taking fullback. I think his minutes could still be a little bit less than we kind of expect. There is quite a bit of depth in those fullback positions, and I still think the Brighton fixtures aren't so good to start. So would I really want to start with him? No, but I still think there's enough attacking value, hence why I've given him an increase. Konsa is actually a very interesting pick where it's just really solid Aston Villa fixtures. If you're actually just looking for a classic guy who is just going to rotate and kind of cover some bad games, and you don't feel so bad about it, and you want perfect, like the best, I guess, 4.5 coverage in terms of like first bench options, I think Konsa is actually that person. In the next tier, we have at 5 million, Nick Williams and Lacroix, who are still fantastic for me. Yes, it seems like Nottingham Forest are very close towards the left back, and in a sense that will probably sort of downgrade my thoughts on Nico Williams. Robinson just doesn't have good enough fixtures. Romero's more so a bench boost one type play who could fit if you kind of need someone who just like has really good fixtures on the weeks that Spurs do. But I feel like if I was to go for a Spurs player, I'd probably go Van de Ven or Porro still, even though Romero is much better at recoveries, which you can kind of see reflected within the Romero numbers versus the Van de Ven numbers. There's a pretty substantial gap there, and kind of why I think that we don't see Van de Ven in a lot of people's drafts. But is that let's say a fixture permanently? I'm not quite sure. Stylistically, of course, there's a very different aspect to how they play as well, right? So that makes a difference. As far as, let's say, Aina, I'm just not sold on him, to be honest. I think he might have safer minutes, so maybe I'm almost underrating him. But with the sort of worst open play numbers, with the worst DEFCON numbers, I just don't see the interest. I feel like there's not enough value there. 5.5 though, once again, I hold that these are all amazing picks, so I don't really have too much to say. Munoz can still be a stellar pick if you want to start the season with him, but I see him more as a transfer on Game Week 4. In terms of the sixes, what's interesting now is I think a lot of people are looking at Tarkowski and Murillo and these other picks and just thinking, you actually don't need to go for a 6 because by going for a 5.5, these players they almost average the same amount every week. This isn't necessarily true, but it's more like a Gabriel or Virgil are like the highs and the lows, right? So you almost feel like the best way to optimize around the sixes is actually having a little bit of better rotation. So for example, when Liverpool have a bad game in Game Week 2, you feel like you need rotation. Same with Game Week 3. And I kind of understand why people don't like the appeal of Virgil anymore. Whereas with the Murillo and Tarkowski, you almost have most games where you just think, this player isn't going to have a crazy ceiling. But if I can get those +2s and they take along and they're my starting defenders and I have to start 3 defenders every week, maybe they're better off. And you save that 0.5 from that. Ait Nouri and Guardiola have flipped because of the sort of Guardiola fitness news. I think Ait Nouri is still a very interesting pick to start, especially if, once again, you have that sort of short-term view in terms of wanting to maximize players at this moment in time. In terms of goalkeeping position, I have to say that there aren't too many changes in terms of the goalkeepers. Verbruggen has given a rise because he's actually started the preseason match previously and he's fit to go. I think he is the best 4.5. Hermansen's joined West Ham. I think he'll start from Game Week 1. I think he's a fantastic, and he's got some really good historic shot-stopping numbers. Sales have given a rise as well. I probably was just disrespecting some of those Nottingham Forest fixtures too much. They're really, really good. And I'd expect them to have a good start once again this season. So giving Sales a bit of a tick there. But that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching the cheat sheet. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Once again, if you want to have a look at getting your team rated, have a look at the link in the description below and tell me what your draft ratings are.